The year is 1917. Radio is in its infancy. Woodrow Wilson is America's 28th president. Ford's Model T is only just catching on with consumers as the first affordable automobile. And the war, started by Germany 3 years prior, is still raging across Europe. Millions are dead, and there's no end in sight.
These days, when we look back on our military history, we rarely look further back than World War II. Yet, amazingly, there are still men and women among us who can remember the First Great War. True, their numbers are few. Less than 30 are still with us. Yet their memories of a time when the U.S. was still figuring out both how to fight a war and how to care for its troops in the aftermath are important to us all. In this Recon, you'll learn what it was like serving in the First World War through the experiences related by some of the men and women who were there. In early 1917, the outlook in Europe was bleak. War-ravaged towns dotted the landscape, and death was everywhere. America continued efforts to broker peace despite growing tensions with both Berlin and London, and those tensions were mirrored on the home front.
Feelings were mixed within the United States of getting involved and also which side to get involved in. As you can imagine, we had a large German immigrant population, so there was a lot of strong feelings towards the Germans. We have a large Irish population, so there was a lot of animosity towards the British. So it wasn't a given that even if the United States got in the war that there would be popular sentiment to join the so-called Allied side, which was primarily the British and the French. However, you had another significant portion of the country that was patriotic. They had perhaps fathers, grandfathers who served in the American Civil War and even further back into the Mexican War or the American Revolution.
In late January 1917, U-boats were given free rein to engage in what German leadership termed unrestricted submarine warfare. 2 months later, Americans were enraged when U-boats sank 3 American merchant vessels.
And then finally, the Zimmermann telegram, which was intercepted in Mexico with a promise from the Germans that if the Mexicans helped create a war against the United States, that they would help get back Arizona and New Mexico, which were lost by the Mexicans during the Mexican-American War in 1846-1848.
On April 6, 1917, President Wilson asked for a declaration of war. Congress agreed. Then Brigadier General, soon Major General John J. Pershing was appointed commander of America's Expeditionary Forces and sent to France.
Over there, send the word over there, that the Yanks are coming, the drones are coming everywhere. So prepare, say a prayer, send the word to beware.
The difficult task of moving hundreds of thousands of American troops began, and too soon for many, they were in the thick of battle.
3,000 miles from home, an American army is fighting for you. Everything you hold worthwhile is at stake. Only the hardest blows can win against the enemy we are fighting.
Almost 9 decades have passed since those days, but here, on a farm in West Virginia, lives one of a very small number of people who can recall them.
And I had copies of it made.
Frank Buckles is now 105 years old, but he was only 16 when America entered the First World War. And on August 14, 1917, after several failed attempts to enter the Marine Corps and Navy, Frank finally convinced an Army recruiter he was old enough to join. As for his parents, they knew nothing about their son's decision until much too late.
I didn't tell them until I was on the way to Fort Logan, Colorado.
After a brief time at Fort Logan, Frank was sent to Fort Riley, Kansas for training in trench warfare. By December, Frank found himself boarding an historic vessel for his trip to Europe. That vessel was the Carpathia, remembered to this day for its 1912 role in the rescue of survivors off the Titanic. The Carpathia was a big ship, but not big enough for the cramped voyage Frank recalls.
Most of those young men and volunteers then were accustomed to outdoor life and not the close confinement of the ship. They'd open up the porthole and we'd have water all over the place.
Eventually, Frank arrived in Winchester, England, the main staging location for American troops headed for France.
I had a feeling that this was real serious business.
Frank and the 100 other men who made up the 1st Fort Riley Casual Detachment had no definitive role in those first days in Winchester.
In the Army nomenclature, casual means unassigned. So the whole group was unassigned. Well, unassigned, but I could do anything then.
Frank had what was a rare skill in those days. He knew how to drive. And once the local motor pool found out, he had assignments behind the wheel of an ambulance and often drove visiting dignitaries. But through it all, Frank had one goal in mind.
Every place I went, I'd use all the influence I could to get to France.
When that didn't work fast enough, he devised another plan.
At the end of this lane, I knew that when the troops would be coming along there, that you could just move or step right in line and nobody would notice it.
3 friends joined in on the risky venture, and a date was set.
I was late. They went to France, but about 2 or 3 weeks later, they came back under escort.
Finally, Frank got his chance to get to France as escort to an officer who had been left behind by his original unit. Various jobs followed, many utilizing Frank's skills as a driver. Luckily, none involved frontline duty, where fellow doughboys were slowly turning the tide against enemy forces, but with a high price in the number of American wounded and dead. At last, the Allied forces proved too effective, and an armistice was declared on November 11, 1918.
The war is over. Into Market Street for the men and women of the city to celebrate.
But in the aftermath of the war, much work remained, and Frank Buckles, like many thousands of American troops, were assigned duties that kept them from home.
I was already attached to the prisoner of war escort company.
Frank was soon on his way to Germany, returning German prisoners of war. More than a year passed before it was time to go home.
When I came back, the war was all over. And the parades were over, too. I really saw a lot and had some interesting experiences, but nobody ever talked about it.